Devon Larratt has a very unique style of training for arm wrestling. He is often criticized for not lifting heavy enough and not using any traditional exercises such as bench press or bicep curls. But Devon has proven to be very effective on the table. In my mind, he is the clear #1 in the world in a 115 kilo weight class, and there doesn't seem to be anyone to challenge him. So Devon's style of training, even if unorthodox, must be working pretty well, demonstrated not only by his current level, but by the fact that his level has increased significantly over the past few years. This video will cover the evolution of Devon's training system for arm wrestling. Hopefully this will allow us to capitalize off of Devon's training success and learn from his training failures in order to progress quickly and without injury. When Devon very first started arm wrestling, he was all about inside arm wrestling. The areas of strength that really mattered to him were cupping, back pressure, and side pressure. Cupping is the combination of wrist and finger flexion. Back pressure will be defined as elbow flexion, and side pressure will be defined as internal shoulder rotation. Here we see a video of Devon from way back in the day training his cup. The goal of this exercise is to prevent your wrist from getting cracked back. If your wrist cannot go back, no one will be able to top roll you. But of course, just preventing a top roll is only one piece of the puzzle. Once Devon stopped his opponent's hand with his cupping, he needed to have super strong back pressure and side pressure to stop his opponent's arm as well. And this brings us to hook training too. This lift is designed to attack both your back pressure and side pressure at the same time. It essentially replicates a defensive hook position. And this lift by Devon was a world record lift for a very long time. So from the combination of Devon's cup training and his hook training, his inside power was world class. And this was reflected on the table, as even people like Richard Lubkes could not do anything to Devon in a hook. But the interesting thing about this type of hook training is that Devon no longer does it. Devon has even gone as far as saying that it was a mistake to train this way. This lift that Devon was doing was able to increase his back pressure and side pressure significantly, but it also contributed to a lot of damage in Devon's elbows. This led to him eventually getting multiple surgeries and rethinking his training strategy. Shortly after this, Devon stopped training side pressure entirely and focused much more on outside arm wrestling. At this point in time, Devon really started to focus on rise, cup, and roll. Rising is the ability to control the high ground in a match. Rising will be defined as the combination of elbow flexion and radial deviation. Rolling is the act of spinning your wrist and cracking your opponent's wrist back in the process. Rolling will be defined as pronation. And again, cupping is wrist flexion and finger flexion. During this time, Devon became far more focused on hand control. If you can control the high ground, bend your wrist, and keep your pronation, your opponent basically has no options. At this time, Devon did still have his inside game if he needed it, but it was nowhere near what it was before surgery. Devon's primary exercises for cupping were things like spinning handles and multi-spinners. Anything that would attack his finger and wrist flexion in a similar way that he felt on the table. Devon's primary exercises for rising and rolling were done using a karate belt. Here we see Devon training his riser by looping a karate belt over the top of his knuckles. And here we see Devon training his pronation by looping the belt around the side of his hand, creating a spinning pressure. At this time, we also saw that Devon was doing a lot of his training through a pulley system on an arm wrestling table. Training specificity is always important. The closer you can get to replicating the exact pressure you feel when arm wrestling, the better. At this point, Devon's training was still somewhat traditional. Rising, cupping, and rolling is considered by many to be the fundamentals of arm wrestling. So Devon focusing his energy on these exercises made a lot of sense. But this was not the end of Devon's training journey. Very recently, Devon did something unorthodox, something that was not considered fundamental. Devon pretty much stopped training his cup entirely. As of late, Devon has become convinced that the only thing that really matters is controlling the high ground. He no longer trains rising, cupping, and rolling. He now pretty much only trains rising and rolling. And the way that he trains them is also very interesting. At least from the footage Devon has released, it seems like he has stopped training with a pulley system on an arm wrestling table. He now trains by sitting down in a chair and using his knee as a pivot point. This is the primary lift Devon uses for rising, and this is the primary lift Devon uses for rolling. These lifts may look a bit goofy at first, but they are actually very well thought through and calculated. One of the major issues that arises from training rising and rolling on a table is that you have a tendency to bring your shoulder forward. The more you bring your shoulder forward, the more you incorporate side pressure into the lift instead of back pressure. As I mentioned earlier, Devon is no longer a fan of training side pressure. When Devon lifts from this seated position, you can see that his elbow is vertically aligned with his shoulder. This means that he is using entirely back pressure and no side pressure. There are even moments where Devon's elbow is outside of his shoulder. This means he is using elbow flexion and even some reverse side pressure. Reverse side pressure will be defined as external shoulder rotation. Here we see a video from 201 Arm Wrestling demonstrating how reverse side pressure can be very helpful to prevent your opponent from setting a hook. It's not only reverse side pressure, but it's the combination of reverse side pressure, back pressure, and pronation all at the same time. And by putting his elbow on the outside of his leg like we see here, this is exactly what Devon is training. And as we have seen in his matches, the combination of these pressures has made Devon pretty much unhookable. But there is something else that Devon has done that is perhaps even more controversial than not training his cup. And this is his set and rep scheme. Devon is no longer using 3 sets of 10, 5x5, or something more traditional. Devon has been doing a ton of single reps. And not only that, but he is doing single reps all throughout the day. Devon said that sometimes that could be as often as every 20 minutes. And the weight Devon is working with will be somewhere around 90% of his 1 rep max. So basically, Devon is doing heavy singles on rising and pronation all day long. Now it is important to note that Devon is training isometrically here. Devon is still doing a massive amount of volume, but the fact that he is doing primarily isometrics means there will be minimal muscle tearing. So the volume may not be quite as high as it seems initially, but it is still a ton. A bit more recently, we've also seen Devon doing some higher rep blood flow training with rubber bands, but he is still using essentially the same exercises. The only thing he cares about is rising and rolling. It's also worth noting that Devon has been doing quite a few thumb curls as well. To what degree this is trolling, we may never know. But the thumb is definitely a very important part of arm wrestling. Your thumb is what gives you immediate access to your pronation in a match. However, your thumb will also be trained simply from doing the pronation exercises Devon is doing here. So isolating your thumb may not be totally necessary unless you're just a little bit crazy. Something else that is important to remember is that Devon spent years building up his side pressure and cupping. So just because he doesn't really train them anymore doesn't necessarily mean that no one should train them. Devon already has a foundation of strength in these areas. Devon also spends a lot of time at arm wrestling practice in which his cup and side pressure will be trained. All that being said, if you want to train like Devon Larratt, the key is rising and rolling. Whether you are doing singles with heavy weight or higher reps with rubber bands, the principle is the same. You want your pronation, radial deviation, and elbow flexion to become stronger over time, and maybe even some external shoulder rotation as well. But of course, even if you build up a huge amount of strength training in this way, it will not be very effective on the table unless your technique is perfect. When Devon talks about weight training, he often refers to it as homework. Devon is still a big advocate of table time as the basis of your training. Lifting weights gives you the ability to vary resistance and target specific muscles, but table time is what will teach you how to arm wrestle and make use of the strength you build using weights. Devon also maintains that nothing you are doing in the gym should ever cause you pain. If something is causing you pain, it is likely causing damage, and this should be avoided. And of course, you can't make a Devon training video without at least mentioning pumpkin training. Pumpkin training simply means that Devon only trains his right arm with weights. However, only training one arm probably would not be recommended for most people. And really, whether you're training 1 or 2 arms, Devon's training style should be just as applicable for the most part. So for a final summation of Devon's training style, rising and rolling are king. Don't worry about side pressure, don't train through pain, maybe throw in some cupping or supination here and there, but above all, eat as many pancakes as you possibly can.